The Figure in the Shadows by John Bellairs. Chapter 7. As soon as Louis got home from school that day, he called up Rosrita, but her mother answered and said she wasn't back yet. Later that evening, Louis tried again and got her. Both of them tried to apologize at once. Rosrita had heard from several people about Louis's fight with Woody, and she said that she was sorry for having doubted him. Louis said he was sorry he had lost his temper. By the time the conversation was over with, everything seemed to be all right, at least for the time being. A few days after his fight with Woody Mingo, Louis began to get the feeling that company was coming. He didn't know why he had this feeling, but he did have it. It started with when he was setting the table. He dropped a knife, and then he remembered the old saying, if you drop a knife, then company is coming. Normally, Louis didn't believe in old sayings and superstitions, but the feeling he got was so strong that he began to wonder if there wasn't something in the old proverb after all. That night, Louis sat on his cushioned window seat and watched the snow come down. It was the first snowfall of the winter. Louis was always very impatient for the first snow, and if it didn't stay on the ground, he got angry. But tonight's snow looked as if it was going to stay. It swirled past his window and drifted into dreamy shapes under the tall chestnut tree. It sparkled in the cold light of the street lamp across from Louis's house. It piled up on window ledges and doorsteps. Louis sat there thinking about all the things he would do when there was a lot of snow on the ground, like sledding down Murray's Hill with Rosrita, like walking home from church at night with Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman, like wandering the snowy streets alone by moonlight and imagining the snow wall between the sidewalk and the street was the wall of a castle, and that he was pacing the ramparts, planning how to hurl back an enemy assault. Louis closed his eyes. He felt very happy. Then a picture appeared before his closed eyes. A very strange picture. Louis often saw pictures in the dark, just before he went to sleep at night. Sometimes he could see quite clearly the streets of Constantinople or London. He had never been to those cities, so he really didn't know what they looked like. But he imagined he was looking at Constantinople or London. He saw domes and minarets and steeples and streets and avenues. They appeared in the darkness behind his eyelids. The picture that came to Louis now was the picture of a man walking up the Homer Road toward New Zebedee. The Homer Road was a winding country road that ran between New Zebedee and the very small town of Homer. Louis had been over the Homer Road quite a few times this last summer, going to and from Mrs. Zimmerman's cottage on Lion Lake. As Louis watched, the picture moved. The man was walking straight up the center of the road, leaving footprints in the snow behind him. Since the only light in the picture was moonlight, Louis could not see too much of the man. In fact, he could not see enough to tell whether the figure was a man or a woman, but somehow he felt sure it was a man. The man had a long coat on. It flapped around his ankles as he walked, and he was walking fast. Now the man was passing the gas station at Eldridge Corners. He paused to look at the old rusty signpost, and then he took the fork that led past the humming brightly lit powerhouse. Now he was crossing the railroad tracks just outside the city limits. Louis opened his eyes and looked out into the snowy yard. He shook his head. He wasn't at all sure he liked the picture that had come before his eyes. He couldn't say why. The dark figure frightened him, but it did. He hoped that it was not the company that was supposed to be coming. One afternoon, not long after Louis had had this strange nightmare vision, something else happened. Louis was on his way home from Rosrita's house. He was just walking along, staring at his shadow, when he noticed a piece of paper lying on the sidewalk in front of him. For some reason, he stopped and picked it up. It was just a sheet of blue-ruled notebook paper that some kid had been practicing his handwriting on. At the top of the page was one of those double rainbows you had to make when you were warming up during handwriting class, and below that was a neat row of small V's, and another row, this one, capital V's. The capital V's all looked just like the V in Venio, the word that had appeared on the postcard. Louis could feel his heart beating. He glanced quickly down at the paper and saw the word he dreaded. It was written on the bottom line of the sheet. Venio. Louis felt sick and shivery. The word on the paper squirmed before his eyes. As Louis stood there trembling, a sudden gust of wind snatched the paper from his hand and blew it across the street. He started to go after it, but the wind was blowing so hard that by the time he had run across to get it, the paper was gone. Gone like the postcard. Louis felt that sick chill again. His heart continued to beat in thick, heavy beats under his winter coat. Venio means I come. Lewis repeated to himself. Venio means I come. But who was coming? The man Lewis had seen in his daydream? The dark figure on the Homer Road? Whoever it was, Lewis didn't want to meet him. As he walked home, Lewis began to argue with himself. He always did this when he was trying to fight his fears down. He dreamed up logical explanations for the things he was afraid of, and sometimes these explanations made the fears go away. For a while, at any rate. By the time he got to his house, Lewis had persuaded himself that the midnight postcard was just something he had dreamed about. You couldn't always tell when you were sleeping and when you were awake, after all. He had just dreamed that he had gone downstairs and found a postcard with Venio written on it. But what about the paper he had just found on the street? Well, Lewis argued, that was just some show-offy grade school kid who had learned to write Latin. That was all it was. It was just a coincidence that the kid had used the same word that appeared on the postcard. Or maybe Lewis had just imagined that he saw the word Venio on the piece of paper. It could have been Veronica or some name like that. As he hung up his coat and went in to have supper, Lewis went on arguing inside his head. He wasn't really convinced by his clever explanations, but they made him feel better. They helped him fight off the black, shapeless fear that was forming in his mind. That evening, Lewis decided to do his homework down at the public library. The library was a pleasant place to work with its old scarred tables and green-shaded lamps. Lewis went there a lot to browse or look things up. He packed his books into his briefcase and stomped off toward the library through the snow, whistling cheerfully. Lewis worked at the library till closing time, which was 9. Then he packed up his books again and got ready to leave. 9 was a little late for him to be walking the streets of New Zebedee alone, but he wasn't worried. Nothing bad ever happened in New Zebedee, and besides, he had his amulet with him. Lewis was about 3 blocks from the library when he saw someone standing under the street lamp on the corner. At first he was scared. The dark figure on the Homer Road flashed before his eyes, but then he laughed. Why was he so silly? It was probably just old Joe DiMaggio. There was a bum in New Zebedee who called himself Joe DiMaggio. He wore a New York Yankees baseball cap and handed out pens shaped like baseball bats. The pens were all inscribed Joe DiMaggio. Sometimes Joe helped the police check the doors of the shops on Main Street, and sometimes he waited under street lamps to jump out at kids and yell "Boo!" at them. That was probably who it was standing there under the light. Good old Joe. "Hi there, Joe," Lewis called, waving at the still figure. The figure walked forward out of the circle of lamplight. Now it was standing before Lewis. Lewis smelled something. He smelled cold ashes. Cold, wet ashes. The tall, muffled figure stood there, silent, towering over Lewis. Lewis felt queasy inside. Joe was just a short little guy. It couldn't be him standing there. Frantically, Lewis fumbled with the zipper on his coat. His hand closed over the part of his shirt where the amulet was bunching up the cloth so that the hard little object was inside his fist. And at that, the figure took one sudden gliding step forward and spread its arms wide. Lewis let go of the amulet with a shriek. He turned and ran for his life, stumbling over snowbanks and in and out of slush puddles and over slippery, smooth patches of ice till he reached the stone steps of the library. Then he scrambled up the steps and banged violently with his hands on the glass. He banged till the palms of his hands stung. Nobody came. At last he saw a light come on in the foyer of the library. Miss Greer was still there. Thank God! Lewis stood there with his face and hands pressed against the glass. He was half out of his mind with fear. At any second he expected to feel hands clawing at his back, to be spun around and pressed into the face of he didn't dare think what. Finally, Miss Greer came. She was an old lady and had arthritis, and she walked slowly. Now she was fumbling with the lock. Now the door swung inward. "My goodness, Lewis! If I was to tell your uncle that you were pounding away to the beat of the band, to beat the band like that—" Miss Greer stopped her scolding when Lewis threw his arms around her and shook her frail old body with his frightened sobs. There, Lewis, it's all right, what in the world?" Mrs. Greer was not a mean old lady by any means. She liked children, and she especially liked Lewis. "For heaven's sake, Lewis, what happened to make you—" Please, Miss Greer, call my uncle," Lewis sobbed. "Call him and tell him to come down and get me. There's somebody out there and I'm scared." Miss Greer looked at him, and then she smiled kindly. She knew about children and their wild imagination. There, Lewis. Everything's all right. Just sit down here on the step and I'll go call your uncle. It'll only take a minute." "No, don't go away, Miss Greer. Please, I want to come with you," So Louis followed Miss Greer into her office and stood, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. As she asked the operator to give her the Barnevelt residence, it seemed to Louis that Jonathan was taking forever to get to the phone, but finally he answered. Then he and Miss Greer talked for a little while. Louis couldn't tell much from the noises Miss Greer made, but it seemed obvious that Jonathan was puzzled. As well he might be. A few minutes later, Jonathan's big black car pulled up in front of the library. Louis and Miss Greer were waiting on the front steps. As soon as Louis was in the car, Jonathan turned to him and said, "What happened?" It was something pretty awful, Uncle Jonathan. It was a ghost or a monster or something, and it tried to get me." Louis put his face in his hands and started to cry. Jonathan put his arm around Louis and tried to comfort him. There, Louis, don't cry. Everything's all right. It was probably just somebody trying to scare you. Halloween is over with, but there's always someone who doesn't get the word. Don't worry, you're all right now." That night, Louis lay wide awake in his bed, listening to his heartbeat. His closet door was open, and he could see the clothes hanging in a shadowy row. Were they moving? Was something there behind them? Louis thrashed up into a sitting position, frantically fumbled for the switch on his bedside lamp. He felt all over the lamp before he found it, but finally the light came on. There was nothing there. There were no dark shapes waiting to jump at him. None that he could see at any rate. It was a long time before he could bring himself to get out of bed and look in the closet. Finally, though, he did. There was nothing behind the clothes, nothing but plaster and wood and dust in his old shoes. Louis went back to bed. He thought that maybe he would try to sleep with the lights on tonight. Louis tossed and turned. He rolled over to one side and then to the other. It was no good. He wasn't going to sleep. Well, if he wasn't going to sleep, he might as well think. He didn't have to think very hard. Louis knew very well what was behind all the weird things that had been happening to him lately. The amulet. All his logical explanations had evaporated, and he was left with one thought. The amulet was haunted. It was haunted, and he had better get rid of it. So what if it had helped him beat up Woody Mingo? So what if it did give him that wonderful pirate movie feeling? Louis thought about how he had felt when his hand closed around the amulet and the dark figure leapt at him. He shuddered. He just had to get rid of it. Louis raised his hands to his neck, but when they were a few inches away from the chain, they stopped. He grunted and pushed, but he couldn't force them to go any farther. His hands trembled. They shook like the hands of an old man who had the palsy. But they would not close around the chain so that Louis could take the amulet off. Louis sat up panting. His pajama top was soaked with sweat. He looked at his hands. Did they belong to him anymore? Louis was scared, thoroughly scared, and he felt helpless. What would he do if he couldn't take it off? He imagined the amulet chain growing into his body as he got older and older until there was only a looped line with a bump on his skin to show where they were. Louis's fear was close to panic now. He jumped out of bed and started pacing up and down the room. He would have to calm down before he could decide what to do. He looked toward the fireplace and he smiled. Every room in this enormous old mansion had a fireplace in it. Louis's own personal fireplace was made out of black marble, and there was a fire laid in it, though it was not lit. Little dry twigs underneath the bigger sticks above it. On the andirons, there was a box of matches on the mantel. Louis took them and knelt down to light the fire. In a few minutes, he had a good blaze going. Louis put up the screen and sat there on the rug, staring at the fire. Should he tell Uncle Jonathan about the amulet? Jonathan was a wizard. He would know what to do, or Mrs. Zimmerman. She was a witch and even more powerful than Jonathan. But Louis was afraid of what they would think when they found out he had been messing around with magic again. He should have turned Mrs. Zimmerman's book over to her the minute he found it. When she found out what he had done, she would probably be furious. But what would Jonathan do? Would he decide that 1 year was long enough time to be Louis's legal guardian? Would he send him off to live with Uncle Jimmy and Aunt Helen? Aunt Helen had a personality like a leaky inner tube. She sat in an easy chair and whined about her asthma all day. Louis thought about what life with Aunt Helen would be like. No, he did not want to tell Uncle Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman about the amulet. Then who could he tell? Rosrita. Louis grinned. Sure, he would call her up in the morning and they could get together to decide what to do. If he couldn't take the amulet off himself, then Rosrita could do it for him. The fire crackled cheerfully. Louis felt better. He also felt very sleepy. After making sure the fire screen was in place, Louis stumbled off to bed and threw himself down. If he had any dreams, he didn't remember them, and that's the end of the chapter.